Hello and welcome to Concert 101. I'm Alethea Coombe and I'm Artist Liaison with the Tasmanian Symphony Orchestra. For this week's program we have two momentous works, Brahms' Piano Concerto No. 2 in B-flat major Opus 83 and Tchaikovsky's Symphony No. 5 in E minor Opus 64, conducted by our chief conductor Eivind Aadland and featuring Simon Trpčeski on piano. The weight of expectation on an artist can be a double-edged sword. This was particularly the case for Brahms. When, as a young composer, Brahms met with Robert and Clara Schumann, he was declared as the heir of Beethoven. Robert Schumann, who was no stranger to flowery metaphors, published this quote in his New Music Journal: "One whose mastery springs fully armed from the head of Jupiter has arrived, a young blood, at whose cradle graces and heroes kept watch. His name is Johannes Brahms." The ongoing support of the Schumanns certainly gave Brahms a leg up in his career, but also the burden of upholding and carrying forward Brahms's legacy. Indeed, in Brahms's home, a marble bust of Beethoven looked down on the spot where he composed, a constant reminder of his musical heritage. At the time that Brahms wrote his second piano concerto, he was already well established, having written 2 symphonies, the Violin Concerto and the Academic Festival Overture, as well as a great number of chamber music works. So unlike his first piano concerto, written 22 years earlier, he did not need to prove himself as a composer or virtuoso pianist at this point. This public success, however, did nothing to curtail his perfectionism and self-critical nature. This tendency could be seen in the long gestation periods of his compositions. It would be years, sometimes even decades, before he felt some works were ready for public performance or publication. He also destroyed many of his early sketches, unfinished compositions, and early works that didn't meet his high standards. His self-critical nature tempered into a self-deprecating one when he wrote to Clara Schumann about the piano concerto, saying, "I have composed a tiny piano concerto with a wisp of a scherzo. Sitting at around 48 minutes, this concerto is considerably longer than most concertos of the time and has 4 movements instead of the typical 3. The first movement, Allegro non troppo, begins with a noble and serene opening call from the principal horn, played by Greg Stevens. The piano, instead of establishing a different voice, fills out the end of the horn's phrase. After the second iteration, the mood changes with a dramatic piano cadenza, and some see this as a nod to Beethoven's Emperor Concerto. The second movement is a tumultuous symphonic scherzo in D minor. We have fleeting moments of calm reflection and an abrupt orchestral transition to D major, but overall the character remains agitated. The third movement begins with an extended and very tender cello solo, played by TSO's principal cello, Jonathan Bakesh. Both in character and scale, this feels much more like chamber music, one of Brahms's favourite mediums. I hope you get goosebumps like I do when the piano finally enters in this movement. The last movement is charming, graceful and light in character, starting with a salon-sized feel that bursts into full orchestral sound. Some aspects of character and rhythms of this movement borrow from popular styles of music of the day, including some references to Hungarian folk music that Brahms used extensively in his other compositions. The concerto was premiered in Budapest with Brahms himself as soloist. It was well received at its premiere, and even Brahms himself considered it a success. Tchaikovsky's Symphony No. 5 is a centrepiece of the modern classical canon and enjoys popular acclaim today. However, it emerged from a tumultuous period in Tchaikovsky's life. It had been 10 years since his last symphony and 10 years since the disintegration of his marriage, and both of these weighed heavily on his mind during the composition of this work. Tchaikovsky was questioning what he had to say as a composer, saying, "I'm terribly anxious to prove not only to others and also to myself that I'm not yet played out. I often have doubts about myself and ask myself, hasn't the time now come to stop? Haven't I always overstrained my imagination too much? Hasn't the source dried up?" The other thing that weighed deeply on Tchaikovsky was his separation. A decade earlier, he'd married a young woman he'd only known for a short time, and the union lasted a mere few weeks. Some speculate that this hasty marriage was driven by family pressure and societal expectation rather than passion. Tchaikovsky was a deeply private person, but there are veiled references in his diaries uncovered after his death, which hinted him questioning his sexual orientation. What is clear, though, is that both as a composer and a person, Tchaikovsky was deeply mindful of his public image. He would have been acutely aware that anything aside from heteronormativity would have not been met with support. Tchaikovsky wrote to his friends and family about the inspiration for this symphony. He said of the introduction that it's complete resignation before fate, or, which is the same thing, before the inscrutable predestination of providence, murmurs of doubt, complaints, and reproaches against XXX. What this XXX was referring to, we'll never know, but the insistence and directness of this fate theme is palpable. One commentator said of the time, if Beethoven's fifth is fate knocking at the door, Tchaikovsky's fifth is fate trying to get out. The first movement doesn't contain any preamble. We launch straight into the theme, played by clarinet and lower strings. After this statement, the strings pick up the pace, and from the clarinets and bassoons, we hear the first of three major themes of this movement. It's got a skipping rhythm and moves ahead much more than our opening. The first movement contains the most varied and rich material of the symphony. Tchaikovsky introduces hit after hit with his themes in this movement. The second movement begins with hushed, sustained strings, setting us up for a tragic slow movement. In an unexpected turn of events, the most gorgeous theme emerges, played on French horn. It conveys both adoration and optimism, but is tinged with pain. You'll hear our fate theme burst out in a dramatic moment with the lower brass. The third movement is a charming waltz, and you'll hear some playful rhythmic treatment by Tchaikovsky in the way that melodies and interjections are seamlessly passed through the whole orchestra. In the fourth and final movement, we'll launch straight into the fate theme by the strings. The trumpet call, however, pivots the darkness of this theme into a glimmer of hope. A dramatic and rousing vivace section embodies the last big struggle before we reach the finale, which leaves the listener in no doubt of a triumphant resolution. Tchaikovsky himself conducted the premiere the following month. It was received enthusiastically by audiences and friends. However, the critics gave it a mixed reception. This played into Tchaikovsky's self-doubt, who wrote, "There is something repellent in it, some over-exaggerated colour, some insincerity of fabrication." It was not until the following year, when Brahms heard a performance in Hamburg and expressed his admiration for the new work, that Tchaikovsky was able to love it again once more. We will now have a chat about these works with our chief conductor, Eivind Aadland. So, Eivind, in the Brahms Piano Concerto, the piano takes on a number of different roles in relation to the orchestra. Can you tell us about the different roles and what you think Brahms was trying to do with this?
I see both of the Brahms piano concertos as really as symphonies with piano solo. They're huge pieces, and the second piano concerto is probably the longest piano concerto that had been written at that time. So it's symphonic writing for the piano as well, I feel. We don't have many passages as you would have in Tchaikovsky, for instance, with passages flying over the orchestra as ornament, more or less. It's all with the main musical material. It means the piano accompanies the orchestra sometimes. It dominates, and it has solo cadenzas where it almost sounds like an orchestra. So it's such a rich piece Brahms is so inventive. And he worked for 3 years on this second piano concerto. And he was joking in letters that I'm working on a small piano concerto. It's really just some piano pieces put together and with a light little scherzo. And the scherzo is huge, and the whole concerto is huge. So I think there is kind of a symphonic idea that it's based on. And there are many unusual things in the instrumentation. For instance, we go more or less straight into piano cadenza, which normally would happen at the end of the movement. The slow movement starts with a cello solo, so the whole movement is based on a beautiful tune played by the solo cello, which incidentally he made into a song later on. It's called Immer leiser wird mein Schlummer. It means ever gentler my sleep becomes. So it's about leaving this life. And the starting point was the piano concerto, then turned into a song. But this melancholic element, I think, is always there in Brahms. There's something sentimental, melancholic, also in this beautiful slow movement.
So Brahms incorporates elements of Hungarian folk music in the finale of this concerto.
Yes.
How do these folk influences kind of manifest in the music? And how do they contribute to the overall character of the piece?
I think the last movement is, with such a huge piece, you cannot really talk about lightness, but there is an element of something lighter in the finale. Through these folk music elements and Hungarian singing from the heart, melody as the second theme, there's also something very unusual in the instrumentation, because you have timpani and trumpets in the first two movements. Then you would expect them to come back and play for the grand finale, but they don't. So there is a lightness of instrumentation, orchestration as well in the last movement. Of course, it builds up to a brilliant ending. But I think the folk music element brings some light into this finale. So it doesn't just become heavy and big, and so inventive and so beautiful.
Moving on to Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony, I sort of imagine that maybe this symphony has been with you for a long time as probably a young orchestral player, and then career as concertmaster, and now as a conductor. Has your sort of interpretation changed a lot over time?
It's a good question, but it's one that's hard for me to judge. I have to confess that I grew up listening to the Mravinsky Leningrad recordings of these, and they are phenomenal. And I would still recommend people to listen to these fantastic recordings. I think I've moved away from them. One example is in that recording, which I really love. The last movement is so much faster than the composer writes in the metronome marks. So I think I'm moving more towards what I think was Tchaikovsky's intentions. But when I prepare, like for this concert, I try to open the score and every time look at the musical text, look at the tempo markings, look at the metronomes, and have the feeling that I'm relearning it every time. At least I'm trying to look at them with a fresh mind every time. And I think there are similarities, how I did this symphony earlier, but I cannot really tell. It's so instinctive, this whole process.
And I was wondering if someone was to come into our concert halls and hear this symphony for the very first time, what would you want to say to them? What would you like them to hear?
First of all, there's a little thing you can try to see if you can follow. It's the opening theme of the first movement. Appears in all the other movements. The last movement starts with the same theme, first in minor, and the last movement starts in major. But this theme appears all through the symphony. So if you can pick that out, maybe that's fun. But in the end, that's not important. This is Russian sentimental music in the most positive sense of the word. So it's about emotions, feelings, and enjoy the melodies. I mean, hardly any composer can write melodies as naturally and beautifully as Tchaikovsky. His orchestration is perfect, beautiful, and I think maybe the fifth is his most perfect symphony. So balanced, so beautiful. Of course, there is the tragedy of his last, the Sixth Symphony, which is also so strong. But the fifth is just perfect.
And is there anything else you'd like to add for our listeners?
I'm just looking forward to doing this program. The two pieces are big. They're written more or less at the same time. I think 8 years. Tchaikovsky is 8 years after the piano concerto. They're two works that I absolutely love. And I hope we can make a wonderful concert for you.
Thank you, Eivind. Thanks for watching Concert 101. We'll see you next time.